So I know this will be a surprise to many of you, but I like to plan and think way out ahead on things. So just to kind of make that point, this last week I was flying back from Portland on Tuesday. My flight left at 6 a.m. And because I always take the first flight out because it's important to me that there's a second and a third and a fourth that's a backup plan, which is why I also fly Delta, because every other airline only comes in here once a day, and that's a disaster. So my flight was to fly out of Portland at 6 a.m., which in my head means I need to be to the airport at 4, which I know logically 4:30, even 5 might do, especially at PDX because it's an amazing airport, but I would much rather sit there than run, so 4. And then I know my friend lives a half an hour away from the airport, especially at 4 in the morning, so 3:30, but I'm going to double that time. Margin's always a good thing, right? So I'm gonna leave at 3. Stop looking at my wife. I see some of you looking over your shoulder at my wife. So I'm going to leave at 3, which means I got to take a shower and all that stuff. So 2:45, I set my alarm for. Woke up at 2, and I was like, who am I kidding? I'm not going to fall asleep. So I was at the gate at 3:30 this last Tuesday, which is, I learned that you can walk to the furthest end of every leg of PDX in a half an hour. Like, that's how long the lap takes. So that's all context, because last Sunday is when I flew out. And even the Helena airport, like, it's 90 minutes, and I understand I'm going to sit there for an hour. It's the best hour ever, because I would much rather sit there for the hour than run. So I got home from church last week, and Teresa said, what time do you want to be at the airport? And my flight left at 3, and I said 1:30. I was feeling a little crazy last Sunday, so I was like, we're going to be risky. I want to get there at 1:30. And so we sat down on the couch. She was already making lunch for the boys. She gave me a sandwich. I sat down on the couch. It was about 1:45 when I sat down. About 5 minutes later, I felt my phone vibrate in my back pocket. And I've got all my stepdad's bike parts listed on eBay, and it's kind of addicting when you sell something. So I assumed I sold something on eBay. So I pulled my phone out of my pocket, and it wasn't eBay, it was Delta. And it was a prompt saying, your flight is now boarding. I was sitting on my couch, and I made the flight. Just for the record. To say that the door of the airplane hit me on the butt is barely an exaggeration. So then, going back to Tuesday, I was in the airport in Salt Lake City, actually kind of hoping I would miss my flight because it was 55 degrees there, and I was thinking I could actually enjoy walking around downtown for a day and flying back tomorrow. But then as I was finally made my flight, I said, okay, well, I better text Stan, because my friend Stan Simmons was supposed to speak this weekend. But looking ahead at the forecast, I could see why a 74-year-old guy wouldn't want to drive across the state in, sub-Arctic temperatures. So I texted him before our flight took off, hey, do you need to cancel? Because in my head planner, I'd rather know that now when I hit the ground, so I know that my week just changed starting on Wednesday, versus find that out on Thursday. When I landed in Helena, in the horrendous weather that we landed in, I'll stop complaining, I turned my phone on, and it was Stan saying, yep, let's cancel. So all kinds of plans interrupted this week, and that's okay. But last week we finished up this series, Psalm of Surrender. What we were supposed to do was start a series on the 17th called Listening Therapy, and I'm really, really excited for that because there's some stuff I've been studying on the academic level that I'm excited to talk about. So we've moved that series. We're going to start that next week. What we're going to do this morning is what I was going to do last week, because there's these couple questions, and so around here we call this a one-off. There's a couple questions that I've been working on for the last several months because of a few interactions that I've had that I'm going to share with you in a little bit that I just want to jump into. And here's what I'm hoping that we can do this morning. Some of you've been around here since the Cinemark, and that is such an honor that is the case. Others of you've been here for a few weeks. There's a couple questions, and of course, many of you in between all there's a couple questions that I just think we might get bored asking them. But at the same time, I think if we don't ask them, things can get toxic and go ugly really, really quickly. Like if you do what you do, say at work, and you start doing it for the wrong reasons, that's unfortunate, right? Like, you might not do as good of a job, customers might not get as good a service. There's things that it's sad for certain people if what you do at work or at school, you stop doing it because you believe in it. But if you start doing this for the wrong reasons, if we stop being the church for the right reasons, like if we get toxic and our motives change for why we do this, like, we hurt people for generations. Some of you, your family story is such that you're still recovering from a nun that your dad had in grade school. And I don't say that to pick on Catholics. I have high respect for lots of Catholics. I just say that because it comes up over and over and over again. I hear people reference the nuns that they had when they were in grade school and went to Catholic school. Like, we get this wrong. We mistreat people because we don't like this anymore. We get this wrong, and we start showing up for the wrong reasons. Like, our great grandkids pay the cost of that. Some of you are recovering from that right now. So there's a couple questions that I want to ask, and some of you, my hope is that this is an audit for you. Listen, I hate the thought of anybody leaving Narrate, but I don't hate it as much as anybody resenting being here. And frankly, I don't hate it as much as anybody like just going toxic while they're here. So I think there's some questions that for some of you, we just have to ask them, because it's good to make sure that we still buy into this, that we still believe in this, that we still value this. And for others of you, you're sitting here and you're trying to marry all these things like Christmas Eve and Ales for Trails and Sunday gatherings, and you still don't really understand what the heck it is we're doing. And I'm hoping this morning will help you with that. But the questions that I want to ask deal with the how and the why of Narrate. And to be honest with you, a big piece of my motivation for doing this is me. It's a little bit self-absorbed, but I've been stuck in this track for a while, and I think it's good. In fact, I hope I'm always stuck in this track. But the track is like, am I? So as much as I'm going to ask you, I'm asking myself, am I doing this for the right reasons? Because here's the tricky thing about my world, and this is true of Kate and Hannah and Marla and Doris and Carla and Lexi, and I hope I just named everybody, but if I didn't, I'm sorry. It's true for all of us that work here. Like I don't make my living by putting new roofs on people's houses. I don't make my living by designing buildings. I don't make my living by teaching fourth graders. I don't make a living by doing psychiatric evaluations. I don't make my living by selling things on Amazon. I don't make my living by selling coffee or houses or loans or any of that stuff. Frankly, the way I make my living, and let me just qualify this just for a second, just out of respect, my income is about 60% of our family's income. So with all due respect to my wife, she's a labor and delivery nurse. She brings in a large amount as well. So I'm going to say my living, and it sounds kind of selfish, so I just want to kind of allow, like, it's not all me. But here's how I make my living. I make my living when people like yourself, this may or may not be you, have formed such a connection with God that you start to believe that everything you have isn't yours but God's, that life is a stewardship issue. And therefore, I make my living when people like you decide that you're going to pre-decide that some of what God gives you, you're going to give back to God. But here's where this gets messy. You don't get to give it to God. I mean, not directly. You give it to Narrate, which in turn gives about 55% of what you give to one of the staff. And we spend it on ourselves and then on other things on your behalf in God's name. That's tricky. And it can get tricky because that means when I pay my mortgage, or when I buy a new pair of shoes, or when I buy a set of tires, or when I go to the Blackfoot and have a beer, I'm using money that you believed was God's money that you gave to church to spend on God's kingdom that I'm spending on this beverage. And therefore, that creates this constant internal practice of, do we still believe in this? There's a couple texts that I think are supposed to be terrifying. Because I think one of the questions we have to ask is when we read the Gospels, are we supposed to see the Pharisees as bad, or are we supposed to see them as our own shadow? Like the very person we'll become if we're not super intentional that we don't. Matthew chapter 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where's the one who has been born king of the Jews? We saw his star and it rose and we've come to worship him." Some of you are thinking, I'm having placement issues. It's not December. Why are we reading this story? When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. You know what all Jerusalem means? It's like the federal government passing a law that impacts the way state government is funded, and therefore we would say about that, like all of Helena was disturbed. Why? Because such a large portion of our population, frankly, makes their living through government. To say all Jerusalem is disturbed is to say God was doing something really significant. We're here 2,000 years later celebrating that, or at least considering it. God was doing something astounding, and the very people who made their living and organized their lives around serving said God didn't like it. It's this reminder that we as religious thinking, spiritual thinking people, if we're not careful, we become a part of our own team, not God's team. That they weren't in it for God. They were in it for their own mortgages and next pair of shoes and their own security. And therefore, I wonder if it's essential that we are frequently visiting this issue of, are we sure that we still believe in this? And are we doing this for the right reason? Matthew 23 is another terrifying place. And I understand that this speaks probably more directly to me than to you, but in another sense, it speaks to all of us in the sense that, like, you call me pastor, I'm calling you pastor. Like, we're all serving people with different kind of signatures on the paychecks as far as I'm concerned. Listen to the way Matthew 23 says it. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to the disciples, man, I really have to get a different Bible. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Now, you may or may not know this, but when you were to walk into a synagogue in Jesus' day, you'd walk through the main door. Remember, they didn't sit in rows like you do. They sit around the edges, kind of like the Ming Opera House, if you've ever been there. The seating would be kind of around the edges. When you walked in the door, there would have been a seat right there. That was Moses' seat. That's where the dude sat, so to speak. So listen to what Jesus says. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you, but do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, and they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Again, there's this huge warning, like, these people look the part, but they don't really care about you. They're really doing it for themselves. Everything they do is done for people to see. They make their philanthropies wide and their tassels on their garments long. I mean, that's just like saying they have the sharpest suits and the best shoes. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbis by others. So again, what he's exploring here is this idea that this is about them. It's not about people anymore. And so here's the questions that I want to ask is, how? Like, how do we do this thing called Narrate? And aside from how, why do we do this thing called Narrate? I was sitting on a chairlift. We can go ahead to that next slide. I was sitting on a chairlift recently with a friend, and he's a friend who was a friend before he attended Narrate, but now he attends Narrate, which is, I only say that because that's not super common for me, because I don't, frankly, do a very good job of inviting people to church, because it's kind of weird to go like, hey, you should come to church. Oh, yeah, why? Oh, because you could hear me speak. So I just mostly count on you guys to invite people here, if we're being honest. So he started attending through his own interest and curiosity, and we were sitting on a chairlift, back before we were frozen, because I don't ski when it's freezing like this. And we were on Belmont, so, you got 9 minutes, and that's assuming it doesn't stop at least 3 times. So we were sitting on, I don't know why I say that, because I like the mountain, but we're sitting on Belmont, and he said, Adam, I've been wanting to ask you for a while, does all Narrate's money come in through the buckets? Now, I quickly said, yeah, it actually does. And I realized later, that's not entirely true, because there's also online giving, and there's those people who do things through bill pay. But I was like, yeah. And he said, and it was hilarious, he said, because I put my check in there, and I can't help but notice, ain't very many people putting checks in there. Now, there's the tension, and it's a little awkward to even say that. There is the tension, because here it is. On the one hand, we absolutely want people, you, to feel welcome and comfortable and a part of this place, whether or not a check enters the bucket from you. We absolutely want you to be able to be a part of this, whether you buy into giving or not. And the other part of the tension is, we don't exist unless some people do. There's a tension there. We want this to be the kind of place. If you're someone here, I just met a couple this morning who's been here for a year. First time I've ever interacted with them. We want this to be a place where you can hide. We want this to be a place. I personally, and many of you, are the beneficiaries of walking into a church where you could just be anonymous and chilling out in the back row for a couple years, because it took me a couple years to even begin to culturally catch up to, I knew nothing of this kind of culture. And so we want that for you. And the reality is, we can't exist unless there's people who buy into it in this way. So there's this huge tension. So how do we do this? Here's basically the bottom line business model, economic engine of Narrate. First of all giving is anonymous. I mean, except for one person, because of course we have to have a business manager who knows what exactly happens and who's giving, because we obviously need to manage the $500,000 a year that we have to manage. And Doris could run a small country, so we're very grateful for Doris. And she has the right character makeup, because I couldn't do it. I'm just being honest. The way I do relationship would be different if I knew. I know it would. I'm just not a big enough person for that. So it's anonymous. The other thing you should know is there isn't a trust fund, and there isn't a sponsoring organization, and there isn't some kind of interest that we live off of. The giving that makes this place happen happens because of the people who give here. It's somewhere around 25% of people who are a part of Narrate are regular givers. And Doris would say it's astounding just to see the details and worshipful for her. Everything from the consistent $10 check to everything in between and the big checks. So it's anonymous. You should also know the staff gives. I've never talked about that before, but again, I don't know what they give. I have peers who lead churches where it's just an auto withdrawal from their paycheck. I refuse to do that. I don't want any interest in that. I think the point at which we have to heavy hand money, we've already lost, and all we're doing is buying time anyway. So I don't know how much the staff gives. I just periodically say to them, like, I sure hope you're giving, and frankly, I hope if you're not giving, God crushes us financially, because to me it would be arrogant to ask other people to support us financially but not believe in it enough ourselves. You should know I give. From my paychecks, 13.5%. From my wife's, 10%. I don't say that to brag, but just part of what allows me to look in the mirror in the morning when I pay my mortgage with your money is knowing I'm invested. And I get it. It's a little bit weird. And yeah, frankly, when I give, I'm kind of securing my own vocation. But that's the reality of it. Now, here's the other thing that happened a couple months ago. I was sitting there talking to a friend who I've known since he was a freshman in high school. I've known his wife since she was a sophomore. And we were sitting one morning before everything started in those seats back on this side. And I don't even know how we got on this subject. But he at one point he said, Adam, I'm so grateful my parents taught me to give when I was little tiny. He said, I'm so grateful they taught me to give a dime when I had $1 and $1 when I had $10 and just kind of built that into me. Because then he said, and it wasn't braggadocious, it wasn't this pat on the back thing, but he said, because now when I throw my check in there, he's like, dude, it's a lot of money. He said, that's a car payment. That's a boat payment. Like over the course of a year, and I'm taking a little bit of liberty here, but it's a trip to Hawaii. So it's a lot of money. And then this conversation started, and I'd never even thought of it in these terms before, but as we're talking it through, I was like, I've never considered what that is like to be a person who gets serious about God or gets serious about local church, say in your 20s or 30s or 40s or 50s. And can you imagine arriving at the place, maybe you can, maybe this is where you've been stuck for a while. Can you imagine arriving at the place where you're like, I want to financially buy into this place. I want to give some of mine away to serve people. I want to invest. Can you imagine doing that? Say you make $100,000 a year, and at 45 years old, you decide you want to start giving 5%. Can you imagine? I mean, because here's what occurred to me. Like, I'm looking at in a few years, I'll have 3 kids with driver's license. My friend who does our insurance said, Adam, figure $400, between $100 and $150 a kid. I literally can't figure out intellectually right now how we fit that into the budget. I mean, I know we'll do it, we'll have to, you do it, like that's just kind of life. But have you ever considered, especially those of you who've been sitting in chairs like this for decades, have you ever considered what we're asking people who at 36 years old, they hear someone like me go, well, just start somewhere, start at 3%. That's a ton. And that's difficult. And that's a gigantic sacrifice. And that's how this thing works. It just is. And part of the council's commitment to you is they're not committed to making this thing outlive any of us. I mean, if it does, great. But they're especially not committed to making it outlive God's Holy Spirit and the movement of it. That the buy-in piece is part of it. The reason why we don't ever want to own a building is because, quite frankly, we don't want to be an endowed community where nobody here really likes it, but we should have the community because we want our great-grandkids to get married here. And I'm not taking shots at anyone. It's just saying there's this commitment to go, we've unapologetically placed ourselves right in the tension of my friend on the chairlift. That's hard. And it's how the bills get paid. You know, something occurred to me here a little while ago where I actually think Hannah and I were doing Gather Scatter together, and I made a joke about checks because I realized just real time that like our whole giving mechanism is designed around checks and cash, neither of which do any of us use anymore all that often. And our kids are like, what's a check? I mean, our kids, my kids have never lived in a house with a landline telephone, and they're never going to own a checkbook. And so there was this thing that happened, and Kate and Doris have been working really hard per my prompting and just our conversations to figure out, like, how do we catch up digitally? Like, what happens when a bucket goes by and a person can grab their phone and kind of real-time give and just click a button? And they've been doing all that research, and I've been kind of pushing all that. But it occurred to me a couple months ago of like, wait a minute. That's really not the driving issue. I mean, it is. But the driving issue is 20 years from now, will our kids, will those of you who are students now, will those of us who aren't in our 30s anymore, but we're in our 50s and 60s, will we still believe in what local church does for people, for community, and for connection to God's kingdom? Like, that's the driving issue. And therefore, what occurred to me is that the impetus isn't on us to make giving easy. The impetus is on us to somehow cast vision for, listen, Narrate has been sustained by people locally who gave. Almost every one of you learned to give in a different context. And Narrate now, for almost 10 years, has been on the receiving end of people who built their giving muscle elsewhere, practicing it on our behalf. I guess I would like to say that one of our real legacy audits will be in 10 and 20 and 30 years, will those influenced by this place and us and our kids and our grandkids, will they be sitting in churches in Portland and Seattle or wherever else and giving up car payments and boat payments and making financial sacrifice in those directions? Which really means what we're asking is why? Why do we do Narrate? Why do we do this? You know, there's this thing that Jesus said where he said, hey, go ahead to that slide, Bob. He said, go and learn the meaning of this. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Which to me is this stark reminder that if the only reason we do Narrate is Sunday morning, we're toast. We're all Jerusalem at that point. We're the Pharisees who really only care about themselves. Like if the only purpose of doing this is this, then I'm not convinced we're moving the needle at all. But for me personally, the reason why I still buy into this, the reason why I can still get out of bed and pay my mortgage payment from your God money is because I'm still overwhelmed by the number of people whose first connection is this. Like this, for me, the Sunday morning is still the hub. It's still the connecting point. It's still the place. Things like Christmas Eve and Easter, it's still our best opportunity to put on display Christ followers are just motivated to be internally healthy. They're not weirdos. And I'm not saying there aren't other ways to do that, but to me, it's the hub and the spoke thing. You know, I heard a story here a couple weeks ago. I overheard it, actually, about two families who had gone ice fishing together the previous weekend. And when I heard that, I went, that's why we do Narrate. Because what I know is that the husbands of those two families, the dads, they've been tearing down on Sunday morning probably for 4 or 5 years. And I don't always get to schedule them together, but when I can, I schedule them together because I know that they like similar things. But the thing is, they could both tear this place down by themselves. So oftentimes I keep them separately because they're like a one-man wrecking crew in and of themselves. But nonetheless, that for me, if you're asking me why Narrate, I go that. A hub where people can connect, and then there's relationships that spill out. Many of you were involved in a memorial service last weekend for Sandy Dundas. That, for me, is why we do this. Here's a woman who, in her mid-60s, connected with God in a deeper, more profound way, got super connected relationally, didn't sit around and wait for people to come to her, but started going to the women's Bible study, started going to these other studies, was a part of this place. And guess what? When she was in her moment of deepest need, for the span of 2 weeks while she was laying in a hospital, person after person after person from this place was visiting her. And at the wake that we had for her, where we just tell stories, there were, I would look at women who were from this place and go like, you knew her too, and you knew her too, and you knew her too. And at the funeral, the family's like, 50 people. There were 50 people from Narrate, I'm guessing. If not, it was close. That to me is the why. That here's a woman whose family is testifying how much Christ has impacted her, whose relational network has changed, who in her deepest moments of need, she had friends like this, like you, from this place. Had coffee recently with a gal. Her mom's been attending here for a long time. And when her aunt's in town, her aunt attends, and after it's been a few months, I got this email like, hey, would you meet with my niece? And so I did. Is this daughter of this woman who attends here, niece of this woman who comes periodically. And when I sat across from her, I was sitting across from you at 23, from me at 23. A young girl with a ton going for her who had made some mistakes and got in some trouble with the law and had a pretty toxic relationship that she was trying to separate herself from and was in this kind of trap of a job and wasn't really sure, and it just felt like the world was collapsing and had some debt issues and wasn't sure how to get out of those. And because I get paid to have coffee with people, thanks to you, I was able to sit across the table from her and go, listen, you already have a therapist. You already have a parole officer, like lots of good things are already in motion. You know what I think you need? I just think you need a coach who will kick you in the butt once a week and say, what 10 jobs did you apply for? Have you put your car for sale? Those types of things. So I arranged the next week she met with Hannah. And by Hannah's perspective, that only went okay. Then last week I saw the mom and I was like, hey, so how's your daughter? And she just lit up. And man, as a parent, you can appreciate what it's like when your kid turns a corner. And she said, you wouldn't believe it. She's enrolled in school. She got this internship for this role. She's put in her notice for her job. She finally kind of settled the legal matters. Like, she's in a completely different place. Now, she doesn't attend here. I don't know if she ever will. That's why we do this, isn't it? Had coffee with a guy, that's what I do, so I don't know the time frame, but here's this guy. I love meeting with this guy. I like meeting with all of you. Don't overthink that. But he's a guy who 10 years ago was a drug dealer with a business to cover his drug dealing, who's now a regular attendee at AA, sits in the rows here, has a very successful business going now. And we were talking, and it was one of my favorite meetings ever because as we're meeting, like God's influence on his life and the work he's doing on his self and his relationship with God is so evident. And what I loved was he's so separated from evangelical culture that he's using words like that start with F and are 4 letters to describe the good things God is doing for him. And he doesn't even know you're not supposed to do that. And I sat across from the table and I went like, God, these are our people. I don't care what your language is. My dad's a railroader. I thought that those were periods at the end of sentences until I was 18 years old. But he's a guy who, quite frankly and honestly, he's not a cultural fit, I'm guessing, in most places. That's why we do this. So yeah, I wonder if we just take more seriously the hub and spoke. Every time I hear about, I had this hilarious interaction with Hannah here a couple of months ago where I was like, Hannah, you don't have to let the high school boys eat a whole pizza every Wednesday night, which you all buy, by the way. And she's like, I'm not going to tell them no. And besides that, Scott does too. Like, and they don't have to drink 4 Mountain Dews. She said, I know, but Scott does too. It's just that. Every time I hear stories from the Billius who lead middle school with this great team of leaders, that's why we do this, right? It's this, yes, this is not the end-all, be-all, but this is where the energy emanates from, and this is, quite frankly, where the economic engine is formed, and then we get the heck out of here. And we try to serve people and live organically and be connected. You know, I can think of myriad couples who I remember them when they were here for the first time because they'd moved here from Colorado or Wyoming or Billings or somewhere else. And now they're so connected relationally that I'm like, I'm jealous. That's why we do this. I had coffee or lunch actually recently with this guy who, as far as I know, he's been around church for decades. Newer to Helena, retired to Helena, and we sat down over lunch, and he sat down, and he started by going, Adam, this is so refreshing. I was like, what's refreshing? And I quickly realized he's talking about Narrate. He's been a part of good churches for as long as I've known him. And he said, here's the thing for me, Adam, he said, and he started to describe that there's this group of people that he's been getting to know because of this hobby that he's picked up. And he said, Adam, prior to this, I would be racked with guilt right now because I still haven't shared Jesus with them. I still haven't invited them to church, haven't done any of those things. And then he said this, but now I just feel permission to love them. Like without agenda, to be in their life and just to see where it goes. That's why we do this, isn't it? Scattering was never supposed to be a program. It was supposed to be a mentality, a character, a desire to go like, let's together be influenced. And when tragedy strikes, let's show up. Let's serve one another in those horrific times. And let's scatter. Let's just know Christ in these ways that are accessible. There's this line from AA, and we'll end here. And I've heard people debate whether or not it really comes from AA. But it's something like this. When you don't need us, we need you. To me, that is the motto of the church. Because the reality is that many of you, listen, you know 10 podcasts that are far better than anything you'll ever hear on a Sunday morning. And you already have 30 friends. You don't even have room for more friends. Like, you are set, spiritually set, relationally set. You're so stinking busy with the volunteer opportunities you already have out of here, you're set. I think the real challenge of the church is to those of us who are set, still have a vision for the unsettled version of ourselves. I don't know about you, but I've come up close several times to going like, I just don't know that I need the institution anymore. And then I go back to being 17 years old and knowing that I was wide open to God, but had absolutely no context or no language and no exposure. And it was places like this and people like you where I got to hide in the back row for 2 years that helped me go like, oh, okay. I wonder if the real challenge, the real opportunity, this is why I have so much respect for some of our 60 and 70-something owners. They don't have kids in the programs. They don't need another sermon from me. They got friends coming out their ears. But they have a vision. I'll never forget my friend Bob Strutz, who is this 80-something guy when we planted Harvest. Been around church his whole life, and I don't remember what sparked the conversation, but I remember standing in the side hallway, and somehow the issue of the music came up. And he was like, oh, I hate the music. It's like, what? Why do you hate the music? He's like, I don't like it. And it didn't, you'd have to talk to him very long to know, like, and it wasn't exactly his preaching style either. But then he said, but look in there. Like, there's people who want to be here, and I want to be a part of that. So listen, this isn't a money grab. This isn't an arm twist. This is just, for me, this is an invitation to invite you into your own internal conversations. Because the reality is, for many of you, we need us more than you need us. And yet, if we're going to maintain a place that serves you the way you were served when you showed up, wherever it is you showed up, it involves great people like yourself, making sacrifices of time and money, and understanding that, yeah, we're going to pursue excellence. And hopefully this isn't like an obligatory thing, but at the same time, this is about creating space where people can connect. So I'd like to pray, and we're just going to give you a chance to sing. And I know this is maybe a weird headspace because it's not all that personal, or maybe it is, but I'm going to pray. God, we think back of those places that we showed up, and even if it was this place, we think back of those people who impacted us early on, God. And God, we've never wanted to portray ourselves as being on mission or having this giant agenda in our community other than just to exist, to be personally transformed by who you are and what you're about, and then to just naturally, organically exist in our workplaces and neighborhoods and try to put you on display, God. Thanks, Lord, for this absolutely astounding community of people that you've put together. It's just perpetually humbling and God, quite frankly, affirms to so many of us that this is such a unique thing that you are doing, that at times it's honoring and at times it's terrifying because we recognize that you could pull the rug out in just an instant. And so, God, we open our hands wide. We say we want to be stewards, not owners. That we're just a little tiny piece of the puzzle of what you're doing in Helena. And we trust you. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.